God of glory, King of righteousness. Taste the sweetness of your grace. Let the earth and heaven now proclaim. Holy, holy, holy is your name, oh. Hallelujah, Lion of Judah, our Redeemer. Hallelujah, Jesus, your name reigns forever. Hallelujah, Lion of Judah, our Redeemer. Hallelujah, Jesus, your name reigns forevermore and more. You're my hope and my freedom, the joy for my morning. No matter the season, you're always good. From the dawn to the evening, in suffering, in healing, no matter the season, you're always good. You're my hope, my freedom, the joy for my morning. No matter the season, you're always good. From the dawn to the evening, in suffering, in healing, no matter the season, you're staring at this mountain. No chance I'm getting through. But I've heard they can mount before you. So in your name, I'm asking it to move. So let that breakthrough, miracle, power pour out. With you, my victory is found. Bring that breakthrough, miracle, power, let it rain down.
Welcome. Welcome to the 2021 James D. Strauss Worldview Lectureship. For our off-campus guests, we're happy to have you here today. My name is Dr. Pete Vercruci. I am the interim vice president of academics here at LCU. And both speaking for myself, as well as on behalf of our president, Dr. Silas McCormick, I want you to know we're very happy to have you on our campus here today for what promises to be a very engaging, interesting, and perhaps even challenging lectureship this day. The historical origins of this lectureship actually date all the way back to the year 1979, when a student interest group, for whom Dr. Strauss served as faculty advisor, known as Chi Lambda Fellowship, a group dedicated to encouraging research toward understanding and applying the biblical worldview to all categories of reality, first to help organize a series of Chi Lambda lectureships. In March of 1995, a committee consisting of Lincoln Christian Seminary faculty first launched. They repurposed that lectureship, redefined thresholds for lecturers, and launched the James D. Strauss Worldview Lectureship in honor of the legacy of our beloved and longtime professor of theology and philosophy, Dr. James D. Strauss. Those of us who were Dr. Strauss's students will always remember his defining vision taken from Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 10:5, to bring every thought captive to Christ. Each October since 1996, this lectureship has invited some of the finest minds in the Christian world to address a wide variety of disciplines, especially in the areas of biblical studies, theology, philosophy, apologetics, and contemporary culture. Our first Strauss lecturer in 1996 was William Lane Craig, soon thereafter James W. Sire, a name known very well to some of you. And our recent lecturers have included Dennis Edwards, Devin Brown, Michael Gorman, Harold Netlin, and Holly Ordway. Before we introduce this year's lecturers, I want to first thank the Room for Doubt Project for assisting with the expenses of this year's lectureship. And I want to present the director of that project, LCU's current professor of philosophy and Christian apologetics, Dr. Rich Knopp, who has a few words to say about the Room for Doubt project and who will also then subsequently introduce our guest lecturers for the year. Dr. Knopp.
Good morning. Oh, come on. I'm not going to accept that level of response. Good morning. All right. Maybe I wasn't mic'd yet. Thank you, Pete, for the opportunity to be here and to share with you. This is an exciting day. I'm glad that you're here for this particular session. We have other ones going on. As Pete said, my name is Rich Knopp. I am professor of philosophy and apologetics here at Lincoln and also direct this Room for Doubt project. He said a couple of things about Jim Strauss. Here are some pictures to go along with some of what Pete has already shared with you. We remember Jim like that in a three-piece suit with a tie, and you can see we're kind of away from that style these days. But he influenced so many people on this campus and beyond. very much involved with this statue that we now have out in front of our chapel. These are some of those whom he had mentored and encouraged, many of whom are in ministry, teaching here at Lincoln and in other Christian institutions around the world, literally, and in many local ministries. Pete also mentioned Jim Strauss's emphasis upon taking every thought captive. At one point, Jim had a major heart attack and literally was zapped, you know, with those zappers that you see on TV. I think, was it 21 times? And he was about as dead as you can get. So the resurrection of Jim Strauss was subsequent to the resurrection of Jesus, but nonetheless, it seemed to be somewhat similar. Some of us thought, hey, we have to do something to honor someone who meant so much to us. And so I and some of my colleagues put together a festschrift, or a tribute in honor of Jim Strauss, called Taking Every Thought Captive. We got some hardback copies available for you in the back of the foyer, so check with Hannah Brimner if you're interested in that. Let me say a little bit about this Room for Doubt project. You see the web address here. We'd like for you to go and check it out, the sources that are there. Why are we doing Room for Doubt? Well, it's because there are so many young people and adults, both inside and outside the church, who have serious questions and genuine doubts about their faith. And we want to hit them head on to encourage questions, to address doubts, and to strengthen faith. Our online resources make it very easy for people to ask questions, and we post our responses to those questions. We also have an incredible mobile app that you can take our resources with you anywhere you go, and also provide an easy way for you to ask questions and interact with other people as you converse with them. We have a growing variety of curricular materials. Our first curriculum was a 6-week message and discussion series that Lee Strobel and Mark Middleburg and Gary Poole, 3 guys who have been in ministry literally for 30 years together, helped us to write those original materials. As of now, we've had those materials used in over 200 locations around America and in Canada and in China. We also have more recently developed another lesson series called Strengthen Your Faith. You see some of the covers for these lessons. These can be used for classes, for small groups, youth groups, for Christian camps, and even for individual study. We're also very pleased that this last summer, we offered our first annual summer Apologetics boot camp. This was an 8-week intensive course taught by Dr. Zach Breitenbach. We had 224 people registered from 33 states and 8 foreign countries that went through that course. We're also proud that we have been able to produce some top-flight apologetics animations, and we're very much involved in social media, as well as YouTube and Vimeo and all of that kind of good stuff. I am privileged to direct the program. Zach, would you please stand? Most people on campus, I think, know you. This is Dr. Zach Breitenbach, Associate Director of Room for Doubt. He's been working with this program literally since, 2014 or 15, back that far. And then Hannah Brimner. I don't know if Hannah's in here or not right now. Where is Hannah? She's somewhere over there. She will be at the back and helping assist you getting acquainted with some of those resources. She serves as our tech specialist, you might say. So I just want to encourage you. We have valuable resources, not just for you, but for you to help other people. And our world and your church where you attend is filled with folks who have genuine questions and doubts about their faith. This will provide some resources for you. Now, let me focus our attention on the event of today, this very important Strauss Lectureship. We have a husband-wife team this year. This is the first time we've ever had, a team like that. I say that deserves some kind of a hand of some sort. 50 years from now, they're going to be talking about the husband-wife team that came, and hopefully that'll kind of pave the path for other events as well. Well, these two people, Dr. David Baggett and his wife, Mary Beth are with us today. And they just bring such an astounding background and experience in ministry, in teaching, and in their publications. David serves as a professor of philosophy at the School of Christian Thought at Houston Baptist University in Texas, and he's also the director of the Center for Moral Apologetics. And you'll have opportunity to ask him a little bit more about what in the world is that? Moral apologetics. Dr. Mary Beth Baggett is professor of English at Houston Baptist. She's been teaching English composition, literature, literary criticism for over 17 years. Both he and she have an impressive publishing record. You can see some of their works here. David has written or edited 15 books, 3 of which have been published by Oxford University Press. He's a 2-time Christianity Today Book Award winner. Mary Beth, has co-authored a couple of books with her husband, The Morals of the Story, Good News About a Good God, and Telling Tales, Intimations of the Sacred in Popular Culture. Now, I'm also very pleased more personally to say that David wrote the foreword for Dr. Breitenbach's recent book called Slipping Through the Cracks. Are some lost who would have been saved in different circumstances? And David also was kind enough to write an endorsement for a recent book that I did called Truth About God, What Can We Know and How Can We Know It? Well, this morning's lecture, as you can see from the slide and from your program, is called Taking Sin Seriously, Lessons from Flannery O'Connor. This will be presented by Dr. Mary Beth Baggett this morning. I really want to encourage you, by the way, to participate in the noon session today with that title, as well as 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Those sessions will be held in Dowling Auditorium over in the Restoration Hall building. These are extremely incredible opportunities for you students and staff to have somebody of such stellar importance on our campus. Will you please welcome Dr. Mary Beth Baggett.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Everybody who comes to talk to a campus or give a lecture like this, of course, says that they're so happy to be here, but let me just tell you a little story so maybe you can understand how happy David and I are to be here. We were really looking forward to coming, of course, and I'm even more excited hearing all of that background. I knew a little bit, but yeah, I kind of wish that I knew Dr. Strauss. Anyways, it was very great opportunity for us to work together. We also are now in Houston, having lived in Virginia for a decade and a half. We missed fall, so we're so happy to be here and experience a little bit of autumn. It's 90+ degrees back in Houston. All of that sort of background, though, about how happy we are to be here. Yesterday morning, we were all packed up, ready to go, and we got an email from the airlines. And maybe you saw some of that news about Southwest having a lot of canceled flights. We weren't with Southwest, but our flight was still canceled. And it was, well, I've never had that happen before. I don't know if you have, but I, panicked a little bit, but thought, okay, they're gonna get us there. They know that we need to get where we need to be. And so they did send us an alternative. And we thought, okay, we're gonna get here a little bit later than we would have preferred. It was like 11:30 or something at night, but it's gonna be okay, at least we have a flight. And so we started to punch in the information and we realized it was 11:30 tonight. And we then panicked, After that we prayed, and we decided, and it really was, I think, through the prayer that we found a peace to drive. We live in Houston. So we had a long day yesterday. So I think you'll understand a little bit more when I say
We are glad to be here. We are really, really glad to be here. Thank you so much. So our theme today, as the overhead says, is coming to life. What our hope is over the course of the day is to make plain the promise that the gospel holds for abundant flourishing, for an existence of joy and unending delight. Sadly, and I think you can recognize this, in our culture all too often today, the Christian message is associated with restrictions, oppression, scolding, misery. In fact, I said the culture, but I think sometimes we see that in the church, right? But the opposite really is true. Christ offers us freedom and joy unspeakable, a life that's filled with all good things. Of course, sometimes our understanding of what that good life looks like, because we're fallen human beings, that needs to be corrected. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today, especially in later talks. But we really do see this theme of life, and that's what we're going to really hit on. This theme of life, arguably, is at the foundation of Christian scriptures, beginning with creation, where God fills the earth with swarms of living creatures, and he tells them, all of them, to be fruitful, to multiply. And so we see a God who gives life that yields yet more life. Of course, death is a reality too, and that's a result of sin that we're going to be talking about this morning. Adam and Eve, their rebellion against God, it brought sin and death into the world. To use Cornelius Plantinga's framing, they willfully vandalized the shalom that God had bestowed on them in Eden. And shalom, of course, is more than just peace. It's this idea, again, of life, of fullness. With their sin, they unraveled the web of justice, fulfillment, and delight that God had provided. And of course, it's not just them alone. Future generations, us, we inherit that legacy of sin and death. And of course, we know that legacy all too well from our personal experience. You didn't need me to tell you that there's death in this world, there's loss in this world. Not a day goes by that we aren't touched by this dreadful inheritance. Loss and strife, destruction and oppression, they're so ubiquitous in our world that sometimes we forget that sin is not the way it's supposed to be. And that's actually the title of the Cornelius Plantinga book that I had used. A great book. I highly recommend it. Even still, that promise of life in Scripture persists. Christ has come to rescue us from this predicament, to draw us out of the muck and mire that we find ourselves in. He offers to us life to the full. We see, too, in Scriptures, the culmination of this promise in Revelation with the new heaven and the new earth. And death, we learn there, as hard as it is to really imagine, death is going to be no more. I don't know about you, but I was raised in the church. And I'm going to quote Adrian Monk here. I know we've been watching the Monk show. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the quirky and lovable Adrian Monk. That raising in the church for me was both a blessing and a curse. I'm grateful, of course, for the foundation that my faith that my mother had provided. But if I'm being honest, I sometimes can easily take for granted the gospel message that I heard again and again, week in, week out, for years and years. Familiarity can sometimes breed apathy, after all, and sometimes I have found myself losing sight of the radical nature of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. I've defamed them, domesticated them in my mind, forgetting what an absolutely fundamental difference that they make, both for the future, but not only that, for our life here and now. It does us good from time to time to remind ourselves of these truths, to recapture the wonder and excitement of the depth of God's love for us, to contemplate his desire for our well-being, and to acknowledge that he has the power to make that a reality. So that's sort of our scope of the whole day. This morning, we're going to start with the diagnosis. We'll have hints of that here and there, but hopefully that'll whet your appetite and you'll want to come back. So where are we now? Thinking about our diagnosis, our condition, can hopefully give us a powerful longing for the cure. Despite alluring appearances, sin is ugly and repugnant, deleterious and acidulous. That we often fail to see this, or even worse, that we might see it and indulge anyway, harkens back to that earlier point I had made about the need for moral transformation. So one writer, as the title of my talk calls attention to, is American author Flannery O'Connor. She sees clearly this nature of sin. And I think that she could serve as sort of a surgeon for some moral LASIK for us. So that's my hope. If you've ever read anything by O'Connor, and she is required often in Intro to Lit courses, so maybe you have, you're going to agree that her style is inimitable. It's really hard to reproduce. You recognize it right away. Who else would write of an itinerant preacher who rails against religion? Who else could create a character who founds a holy church of Christ without Christ? That's so her. Who else could risk turning her protagonist into a modern-day Oedipus, self-blinded and all? O'Connor's unique combination of ridiculous caricature, sudden violence, and there will be things that we mention here. She does it for a purpose, though. Her theological heft, wrapped in the cloak of everyday Americana, and her persistent theme of grace to cover a multitude of sins. All of these are distinctive marks of an O'Connor story. She didn't publish many of them. There were only 2 novels that she wrote and 32 short stories. Her life and writing career were cut short at the age of 39. She had a chronic condition, lupus, and this put front and center for her the effects of the fall. She couldn't ignore the fact that death was here present with us. Her father had also passed away from lupus. So she does the same for her readers. The fact that O'Connor was an unabashed devout Roman Catholic makes her literary standing even more remarkable. I had mentioned before that she's on a lot of Intro to Lit syllabi, and she really is. I mean, Christian, non-Christian, secular, etc. I mean, she is in the canon. She is there. The trick of it is that O'Connor is so good, her literary critics can't ignore her. Even more delightful, you can't talk about O'Connor's work without confronting her Christian beliefs. They are absolutely intertwined. Michael Mears-Brunner calls her work theologically freighted. Of course, O'Connor is a keen exegete of culture, too, and her stories explore Southern mores and gender norms. They wrestle with thorny challenges of race relations and socioeconomic dynamics of the Cold War-era Georgia. There's definitely more to O'Connor than theology, but there's not less. In an increasingly secularized world, O'Connor wrote to force her readers to take seriously the inadequacies of their paltry worldviews, whether materialistic or just as bad, tamed and acculturated Christianity that turns the cross into little more than a security blanket. As I think you'll see in the discussion that follows, she truly understood the import of the resurrection, and she has little patience for those who would dismiss it or diminish it, O'Connor recognized what Flanagan calls the tranquilizing and disorienting effects of self-deception. Rather than leave folks where they are, however, to an enervating spiritual ennui, she strove to reawaken readers to moral beauty, to their desperate need for a savior. That was her key theme again and again. She often achieved this goal through shock. She was writing in the mid-20th century, 50s, 60s. Secularism was on the rise. She kind of saw that it was sort of taking a big foothold in the culture. And so she wanted to do something kind of extreme. To quote her goals, "To the hard of hearing," she said, "you shout. For the almost blind, you draw large and startling pictures." This might give you, if you've ever read an O'Connor story, a framework for which to understand her. Startling is an apt description of O'Connor's work. Another is sucker punch to the soul. That's the way that David responded after he read Good Country People, which is one of the stories I'm going to be talking about. I'm inclined to agree. The story centers on a simple and cheerfully gullible mother and her dour, disagreeable daughter. The appropriately named Mrs. Hopewell is constantly at a loss for how to manage her daughter, Helga. Yes, her name is Helga. And of course, this goes back to that large and startling pictures. It's meant to be ugly. In fact, Helga herself has actually changed her name. Mrs. Hopewell, somebody that captures that spirit, certainly wouldn't name her daughter Helga. The given name was Joy. So Joy, she turns away from that, chooses Helga. She did so precisely because of its ugly sound and hideous connotation. She aims to be as offensive to her mother as her mother's vacuous optimism is to her. In turn, you can kind of imagine how well these two fit together in a household. The clashes between Mrs. Hopewell and Helga are both comical and poignant. Helga dresses in a cartoonish sweatshirt with a cowboy and a horse emblazoned on it. The fact that she has a PhD, of course, is also part of the caricature, because you can't even imagine that she has this PhD in philosophy and behaves the way that she does. But again, that's part of the exaggeration. She pouts around the house, mocking her mother's superficial optimism and lording her education over anyone within earshot. Nary a dinner goes by without some outburst by Helga spouting inscrutable and esoteric theories, usually in response to some milquetoast sentiment that her mother says. In one such scene, she stands up mid-meal at the dinner table with just her mother. It's just she and her mother in the house. Her mouth half full to lambast her. "Woman," Helga cried, "do you not ever look inside? Do you not ever look inside and see what you are not? Malebranche was right. We are not our own light. We are not our own light." Mrs. Hopewell had no idea to this day what had brought that on. She had only made the remark, hoping Joy would take it in, that a smile never hurt anyone. Yeah, the Hopewells have issues. Shalom in that household is being vandalized every day. But even after such consistent mistreatment, Mrs. Hopewell, sweet, simple, and innocent as she is, sadly continues to humor and pander her daughter. That probably only encourages Helga's arrogance and condescension. We do learn that Helga was in a hunting accident as a child, and then their dysfunctional relationship becomes a little clearer. Helga, unfortunately, has lost her leg, and now she walks with a wooden prosthetic. It is very sad, But rather than receive her mother's love and embrace any emotional or spiritual healing on offer, Helga instead makes matters worse, stomping whenever she enters or leaves a room, just to remind everyone how terrible her plight is. I think we can easily recognize what O'Connor is getting at. Helga has suffered the effects of the fall. She uses it, though, to justify indulging her worst impulses. It's a temptation for us all, I think, to so emphasize the troubles that befall us that we diminish our moral responsibilities to others. But to do so, as we see with Helga, embroils us in pride and self-idolatry, and all of that's going to further degrade us. Helga's accident, we can acknowledge, was a tragedy, but even more so is her use of that injury as excuse and cover for all manner of selfishness and insensitivity. In the comfort and coddling of her sheltered home life, embrace nihilism with impunity, and still feel insufferably superior to her mother's cliche-addled worldview. It's true that Mrs. Hopewell's cheery platitudes are unequal to the challenges of life east of Eden. Whatever obstacles she encounters, Mrs. Hopewell glosses over them with a proverbial quip. Again, we see this vividly play out in O'Connor's sharply drawn contrast in this scene from the story. Mrs. Hopewell would make these statements, usually at the table, in a tone of gentle insistence, as if no one held them but her. And I love this depiction of joy. The large, hawking joy whose constant outrage had obliterated every expression from her face, would stare just a little to the side of her, her eyes icy blue, with the look of someone who had achieved blindness by an act of will and means to keep it. Nothing Mrs. Hopewell dredges up from her well of banality, pleasant as her attitude may be, accounts for Helga's bitterness, let alone disrupts it. She may think herself a sincere Christian woman, but she has no language or framework whatsoever to account for sin. Instead, she ignores the offense and through sleight of hand sweeps the whole unpleasant notion under the rug. In fact, Mrs. Hopewell's unwillingness to confront the viciousness of her daughter's mistreatment of her ironically accommodates and enables Helga's descent into darkness. This abuse is good for neither of them. It diminishes the dignity of both the perpetrator and the victim. Denying sin, O'Connor makes clear, does nothing to undermine its reality or undo its consequences. On her side, Helga also denies the reality of sin, albeit from a different starting point. Mrs. Hopewell preaches a Pollyannish gospel of positive thinking, where everything starts and ends well. Helga sees morality as a mere construct, as irrelevant to her day-to-day life, as is the God that she also does not believe in. Perhaps Helga finds materialism a more satisfying explanation for the suffering she has endured. She certainly doesn't see her mother's view as helping to explain it. Whatever the case, Helga's atheism and corresponding moral skepticism give her ammunition for judging gullible innocents who still swallow up all that God stuff. But it is precisely this sinful pride, even if Helga doesn't recognize it as such, that is her undoing. Her fall comes by way of a new character arriving on the scene, one manly pointer, a seemingly unassuming Bible salesman who charms and disarms the easily charmed and disarmed Mrs. Hopewell with his earnest faith, his southern slang, and his corny jokes. Helga, on the other hand, sees the apparent simpleton as another means to self-exaltation, another target for her egoistic disdain. Yet Helga's scorn for all things spiritual blinds her to the darkness behind Pointer's guileless facade. Pride, for all its short-term gratification, never fails to bring you crashing down. And even though Helga wants to deny it, she will learn it. In a literary reversal akin to Dante's depictions of hell and the Inferno, Helga endures the natural consequences of denying sin and the self-congratulation that follows her denial. Henry Edmondson explains that Helga is hoisted by her own cynical petard, a quote from him. Nihilism is malevolently seductive and is likely to consume those naive enough to think they can embrace and contain it. Taking Manly Pointer as a folksy, innocent rube, Helga mounts the hayloft with him, where she pontificates about the world and grows ever bolder in her smug contempt of silly beliefs like damnation, salvation, and even love. We are all damned, she tells him, but some of us have taken off our blindfolds and see that there's nothing to see. It's kind of a salvation. Feels a little bit in the story like a secular sermonette. Moves her. She eventually assents to his request to prove her love for him. She makes herself completely vulnerable by allowing him to remove her wooden leg. She may overtly reject her need for human connection, but she nonetheless feels it and gives in despite her earlier protestations. This boy, this is from the story, with an instinct that came from beyond wisdom, had touched the truth about her, when after a minute she said in a hoarse, high voice, "All right." It was like surrendering to him completely. It was like losing her own life and finding it again, miraculously in his. And I think that sort of spiritual sounding language, biblical sounding language is intentional. However, Helga quickly learns that she has placed her trust in a false Messiah. Through her eyes, we experience the gut-wrenching outcome of sin. No matter that Helga has sneered at the concept, the weight of it comes mercilessly crashing down all around her. Manly Pointer, as I've hinted at, is absolutely the opposite of what he has presented himself to be. He is a man who truly embraces the nihilism that Helga has only played at. Pointer values no one and nothing other than his own consequences. Once he has the upper hand over Helga, her wooden leg now absolutely in his control, and she along with it, Manly reveals his true colors, refusing to attach Helga's limb. It dawns on her then, as she can't really avoid it, just how self-deluded she has been. The morality that she has mocked and thought herself above was something that she actually relied on absolutely. She may have professed an atheistic scientism, rejecting the notion of human obligations one to another. But once she finds herself subject to this cruel person's whims, her true moral beliefs are revealed. Manly's taunts, in fact, turn her very words against her, like a mirror in her face. "What's the matter with you all of a sudden?" he asked, frowning as he screwed the top of the flask and put it quickly back inside the Bible. "You just a while ago said you didn't believe in nothing. I thought you was some girl." Her face was almost purple. "You're a Christian," she hissed. "You're a fine Christian. You're just like them all. You say one thing and you do another. You're a perfect Christian. The boy's mouth was set angrily. "I hope you don't think," he said in a lofty, indignant tone, "that I believe in that crap. I may sell Bibles, but I know which end is up, and I wasn't born yesterday, and I know where I'm going." Stories like O'Connor's can cut through our intellectual defenses and help us viscerally feel what we might otherwise deny. Helga's predicament stuck in a hayloft, exposed and alone, victim of her own sin and Manly's cruelty, powerfully depicts the disastrous outcomes of a human heart curved in on itself. It's painful to read, yes. A student of mine a couple years back actually broke down crying after reading the story. She was distraught over Helga's situation. She deemed O'Connor a monster to put her character into such a position and leave her there. It's true, there's vital service. Through these large and startling pictures, she shocks and confronts us with an obstinate reality that we ignore at our own peril. Good and evil, right and wrong, vice and virtue, these are not illusory. They are bedrock truths of our existence. Jettison the terms all you like. Bandy them about in the academic discourse to your heart's content. As Helga painfully learns, and as we really should learn from her example, it's a little bit safer that way, that does nothing to dissolve, disrupt, destroy, undo, or otherwise taint the truth. To think otherwise merely blinds us further from our only path to life. The truth, Jesus tells us, will set us free. And for a character who has denied the truth for so long, something drastic is needed for her to see that truth. Helga's violent confrontation with a truth she cannot easily dismiss, a truth that she cannot stand in judgment over, but one that stands in judgment over her, shatters the illusions that had served her so poorly. O'Connor offers parables of ancient truths. This master of the Southern Gothic, unassuming as she is, fashions her plots into weapons that she aims directly at the heart of complacency and human pretensions. O'Connor scandalizes readers, as Jessica Houghton Wilson notes, by forcing on them an either-or choice between good and evil. The author leaves those who encounter her works no middle ground of compromise. Choose God and surrender to his authority as a creature made in his image, or choose the path of prideful, satanic self-reliance. Importantly, it is not only the atheists among us that O'Connor targets. Plenty of Christians, too, O'Connor understood, also desperately need their complacency disturbed. The gospel is glorious good news, but even believers can easily water down that truth, becoming enamored of our own social standing and confusing that position with deliverance from sin. Through the iconic grandmother, we're shifting to another story, in A Good Man is Hard to Find, O'Connor depicts just such a Christian who desperately needs reminding of sin's destructive path. This grandmother believes in sin, as you'll see, but she seems to think she is somehow immune from its clutch. There are good guys and there are bad guys, and she clearly puts herself on that side of the line. All the while, though, she nurses in her heart the very sin that's going to lead to her ruin. The grandmother's self-imposed misfortunes underscore that there is no such thing as safe sin. What Flanagan says is true, yes. All sin is not equally bad. The damage done by some sinful acts is worse than that inflicted by others. If we had our choice to use his example, we'd clearly prefer that someone covet our house than steal it. Even so, sin is not static. Left unchecked, it grows and spreads. And being sin, the vandalization of shalom, that spread necessarily brings destruction in its wake. We fool ourselves when we think we can contain or manage sin. As Flannery clarifies, when we sin, we create matrices and atmospheres of moral evil and bequeath them to our descendants. By habitual practice, we let loose a great rolling momentum of moral and spiritual evil across generations. Sin, recall, is a path to death, away from life. And immorality, no matter how mundane or socially acceptable, cannot be accommodated without great harm. The first thing we learn about O'Connor's unnamed grandmother is that their family is going on vacation, but she is firmly set against their plans. That's the opening line. She doesn't want to go to Florida and would rather visit her relatives in Tennessee. We know right away it's her selfishness, not concern for her family's safety, that motivates her to warn them about the misfit, an escaped convict who is somewhere in the vicinity of the destination. The grandmother, we learn, thinks a lot of herself. She is prim and proper, dressing up for the trip on the off chance, and kind of bizarre chance too, that the family has an accident and is found dead on the side of the road. Should that occur, she wants to be quickly recognized as a lady in all senses of the word that she prides herself in being. Yes, it's an admittedly bizarre idea, but we'll find out it turns out to be quite prescient. The grandmother does take great pride in herself, so much so that she allows herself a pass on attitudes and habits that she would easily condemn in others. The early scenes of the story are farcical representations of garden variety self-conceit. Laughable, and they really are, and apparently harmless. What's laughable, of course, as you'll see, is O'Connor is kind of pointing these out. But we will see the tragic fruit that it bears. Lined up against Haga, the grandmother would seem a saint, except for the pesky fact that righteousness isn't relative. Moral comparisons can lull us into a false sense of security and blind us to our own shortcomings. A good man is hard to find then, we have set for ourselves. Early in the trip, the family stops at a barbecue joint called the Tower for rest and refreshment. As they wait for their meal, the grandmother commiserates with Red Sammy, the owner, about the terrible state of the world. You just can't trust anyone anymore, she says, and they agree. A good man is hard to find, as the saying goes. Everyone is out to get theirs, even and especially at another's expense. They lament it. Unsurprisingly, as you probably can anticipate, the grandmother and Red Sammy are exempt from such widespread corruption. Despite having just met him, the grandmother reassures Red Sammy that he's a good man and that Europe is entirely to blame for how bad things have gotten. The problem is out there, not in here. Underscoring the irony of that statement, of that idea, the grandchildren spend their time here harassing the tower's pet monkey and disrespecting the adults. Red Sammy's wife also subtly suggests that her marriage is no paradise and Sammy no paragon of piety. Fresh off this mutual admiration society, the grandmother gets it in her head that they absolutely must stop by a plantation house she had visited as a child. Knowing her son Bailey would resist the suggestion, she falls back on her own old standby manipulation, lying about secret panels and hidden treasure. And of course, those are irresistible catnip to the kids' imaginations. The grandmother's embellishments do their trick. The children make a racket until their father caves. And then after a series of unfortunate events, all of which directly stem from the grandmother's selfishness, the family finds themselves confronting, you guessed it, the misfit from the beginning of the story. She had warned them about it, but she leads them to it. In the face of actual wickedness, not the convenient straw man that she had fashioned in her head, her machinations no longer work. She cannot talk her way out of her fate. A few at a time, the family is taken off and killed, and the grandmother begins to appreciate the gravity of her situation. She nevertheless persists in her attempts to save herself, all to no avail. The more she tries to talk the misfit out of it, the less sense she makes, and the more she loses her grip on her professed faith. Eventually, she goes as far as to deny the resurrection. Of course, that's the linchpin of the Christian faith that she claims to profess. Mercifully, that renunciation serves as a significant turning point to reveal to her the poverty of her own resources and the bankruptcy of her faith. She has exhausted herself in this process. She comes to the end of all she has and finds it wanting. Like Helga in the hayloft, the grandmother requires this painful epiphany before she is able to at last see her selfishness for what it is and muster the will necessary to release it. For all her bluster, for all her pleading and bargaining, the grandmother cannot escape the misfit's malevolent plans. In that moment of vulnerability, of absolute dependence, she can now make a genuine connection with another human being. She sincerely calls the misfit one of her own children and reaches out to him. Coming face to face with her mortality and acknowledging the devastating consequences of her own sinful actions, the grandmother is at last open to the grace that she had only ever before used as convenient cover for her selfish desires. That's what the misfit means in his signature line as the story closes. She would have been a good woman, he tells his fellow convict, if it had been someone there to shoot her every minute of her life. Through this pivotal scene, O'Connor makes plain the consequences of sin and its remedy. The misfit, embodying all the wickedness the grandmother has merely trivialized to this point, forces her to reckon with the true nature of sin and redemption. And beautifully enough, this one actually does have a moment of grace in it, to find in those truths mercy sufficient even for her. As with good country people, this confrontation is a violent kind of grace. It upends the grandmother's destructive fantasies about her own goodness. Here, too, we see O'Connor unwilling to patronize her readers. Sin is not to be trifled with, she implicitly argues, letting the chips fall where they may and leaving her characters to deal with the consequences of what they set in motion, counterintuitively enough, is itself a kindness, especially for readers in these scenarios. That vicarious encounter rends our veil of self-deception and presses upon us the very real choice that we all face between life and death. O'Connor's stories are as hopeful as they come, filled with a self-understanding that holds the possibility of belief, as Richard Knopp explains. Grace, after all, does not come cheap. It costs dearly. To truly take sin seriously requires this crucial piece of the puzzle. Sin does not have the final word. There is something more that can set us free from its deadly grasp. This insight is absolutely crucial in any discussion of this kind. It is not taking sin seriously, either to minimize it or to catastrophize it. Sin is destructive. We can never forget that. The wages of sin is death. It disturbs the peace and mars the good and the beautiful. It rails against truth. Embracing sin interrupts justice. But the promise of redemption, we have to remember, remains unquenched. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, as John 1 reminds us. In this world, you will have trouble, Jesus tells his disciples. But he adds, take heart, for I have overcome the world. For all of O'Connor's discussion of sin, she affirms that it's secondary, contingent, parasitical on what's really real. To think otherwise is to lose sight of our good and loving God, who, as Plantinga points out, wants shalom and will pay any price to get it back. O'Connor's talk of sin always points us back to the God who made us, to the God who rescues us from ourselves and offers us eternal life. However, she knows equally well that we cannot make sense of that rescue or even realize our need for it without first taking sin seriously. The sober truth, to borrow once more from Plantinga, is that without full disclosure on sin, the gospel of grace becomes impertinent, unnecessary, and finally, uninteresting. And that's a thought that Flannery O'Connor simply cannot abide, and neither should we. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baggett, for that lecture this morning. We hope you'll join us again at noon in Dowling Auditorium, then again at 3 this afternoon for the rest of our lectureship today. But that will be all for this morning. We're dismissed.
I feel the heat at every turn, but I've heard that you're in it with me. So now by faith, I'm standing on your word, and in your name, no, I won't be burned. So let that breakthrough, miracle, power pour out. I need a breakthrough, miracle, moment right now. Only in you, with you, my victory is found. So bring that breakthrough, miracle, power, let it rain down. Let it rain down. Let it rain. Let it rain down. We trust you. We trust you, Lord. As long as you're in it, the story's not finished. I know you've overcome, so I know I'll overcome. As long as you're in it, the story's not finished. I know you've overcome, so I know I'll overcome. As long as you're in it.